Good morning. Chelsea Bighorn's work, whose art adorns the walls of our nave right now, has been such a help for me for entering into this week's readings. Because her work is at once simple on the surface and enormously complex. Take, for example, the 4 crosses textile hanging on this wall. It is a simple series of 4 textile hangings of different colors with a white cross on top. But it added such complexity for me to learn that the artist grew up in multiple cultures, Irish and United Methodist on one side, and also Fort Peck, Assiniboine and Sioux from Montana, and Shoshone and Paiute from northern Nevada on the other side. And she writes that she starts each day thinking about earrings. Earrings, she says, are my ritual. They connect me to my family and my heritage of beading, weaving, quilting, and quill work. When I learned about her heritage as well as her ritual of earrings, I saw those hangings differently. Or take the small piece furthest this way on the south wall, the south wall here, titled Cradle. It's a paper cut of black paper on top of a material that when light hits it in the afternoon looks like stained glass. Bighorn explains, by meticulously slicing rigid patterns into a medium that when handled poorly will tear apart, I search for how to balance my contradictory identities. But there's also the title of cradle. Cradle boards in Native cultures are a vital tool for carrying babies and a symbol of kinship and identity, often handmade with great care. They can take months to complete and are often given as gifts of wearable art to an expectant mother. And as a Christian, I, of course, overlay the image of a creche or trough on top of the cradle of a human baby laid in a manger by his kin. So simple on the surface and also complex. And I'm sure those of us who go to Chelsea's talk in the parlor after this service will learn more. But I encourage you to come into the nave and meditate on these incredible pieces of art. Simple on the surface and complex underneath. Our gospel text today, alongside our text from Hebrews, does something of the same, simple on the surface and complex underneath. On the surface, we get in the Gospel of Mark an elegant summary of the 10 Commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and adds, you shall love your neighbor as ourself. It is so concise. And it's alongside the readings from Hebrews today, which includes this wonderful phrase that Christ purifies our conscience from dead works, or in Greek, nekros argon, dead works. So we have, on the one hand, the invitation to life, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and your neighbor as yourself, or nekros argon. It's almost farcical. Which do you want, life or death, right? But if we go a little deeper, there's complexity. Throughout the Gospel of Mark, the scribes are Jesus's interlocutors and the villains in the story. But here, the scribe is the one who hears and sees and is close to the kingdom. The villain is not the villain after all. And isn't that so often the case? I gave a sermon this summer about women's ordination and made something of a villain of a sitting bishop of Chicago at the time who refused to ordain women. And I was given a gentle footnote later of how that same bishop personally funded the first 2 years' salary of St. Luke's first female priest, who happens to be sitting over here. Or how we find out that, yes, someone was convicted of a crime, but there's more to the story. Or how George Wallace, the one-time governor of Alabama, who famously declared segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, turned a leaf in his later years, renouncing segregation and working towards its end in Alabama and throughout our country. People are more complex than we give them credit for, and people can change. And we can read this story and miss, in a way that was pointed out to me this week, not just that the villain isn't the villain, but as Sun Tzu Hung pointed out to me this week, that Jesus and the scribe are enjoying one another's interaction and repartee. The scribe asks for one commandment, and Jesus answers not with one, yes, the one from Deuteronomy, but adds on a second from Leviticus 19 about loving your neighbor as yourself. And the scribe responds, adding a third from Hosea, upping the ante, an improv, yes, and you give two, I will give you a third. That these two commandments together are more important than all the whole burnt offering and sacrifices. They are enjoying matching wits and intelligence, one of those rare moments of connection with someone we might have written off. Tuesday is a big day in our country. We included a ton of resources for prayer and vigil and processing in our newsletter this week for tomorrow and for Tuesday. And on the one hand, I can say simply that we are called as Christians to vote our values for whoever we vote for, to vote for what Jesus articulates in today's gospel reading, that love of God and neighbor is the summation of all of the commandments, and that not to vote, not to show up when we have the chance, is necrosargon, a dead work. Maybe it's easy to throw away the right to vote if you've always had it, but being female, I couldn't always vote in this country. And I hold that right as precious and an easy yes. But no matter the outcome of the election on Tuesday, our gospel text, which goes back before the founding of this country, invites us into complex encounters with people we might have otherwise villainized. It invites us into enfranchisement and engaging with the other in ever more complex and expanding ways, to build relationship even as we are polarized on and offline. To engage with the other is, to quote our new presiding bishop, Sean Rowe, in his sermon yesterday, nothing less than standing against the lies of the enemy. And to be clear here, he doesn't mean political enemy, he means Satan. This is the enemy who could keep us small and lifeless and hopeless, that we can't do better than we've done. Elizabeth Oldfield, who is white, lives in Southeast London, a heavily Afro-Caribbean area of the city. And she tells a story in her book, Fully Alive, of being on a nearly empty bus commuting with her two children. A very elegantly dressed Afro-Caribbean woman entered the bus and came directly to where Oldfield was sitting and demanded, "Move your child." Oldfield gestured to all of the other empty seats around, and the person repeated, "Move that child. He doesn't need a seat to himself. I want to sit there." Fuming, Oldfield hauled her 40-pound child onto her lap and sniped back, "There's no need to be rude. A please and thank you would be nice. I'm trying to teach my child manners." The older woman then spent the next 5 stops muttering loudly about disrespect for one's elders. Oldfield writes, "Anyone who has had an uncomfortable human encounter on public transport will know the unique torture of being forced to stay sitting in close confines with someone you find unbearable." But Oldfield had been reading a parenting book on do-overs, the technique of stopping in a power battle and resetting from the beginning. She turned to the woman, stuck out her hand, and said, "Shall we begin again? I'm Elizabeth. What's your name?" Oldfield writes, "I have never experienced a situation turn so quickly." She smiled, then laughed, then introduced herself. We went on to have an enjoyable conversation about our shared love of the area. I'm sure I had presented, and let's be honest, had acted like one of the entitled white women who'd recently moved to the gentrifying area that had been her home for decades. No matter what happens on Tuesday, we are called to find ways to love our neighbors on Tuesday and on Wednesday, to engage with the scribe, to engage one another in live works, not dead works, hard as it may be, to ask for a do-over when we can. Every Wednesday, a team gathers in the chapel for Eucharist and healing prayer, and now to meditate with music from the Oud, thanks to Will Pierce, on how to love and what to do. It is so simple on the surface and so complex underneath to do what Jesus instructs and models. Amen.